Now on to our main event. Scott LaMar has worked in both radio and television for more than 4 decades. Currently, LaMar is the host and executive producer of the Daily Smart Talk news and public affairs program on 89.5 and 93.3. Previously, LaMar was WITF TV's senior public affairs producer. LaMar has won more than a dozen Pennsylvania Associated Press Broadcast Awards since 2000 and has been nominated for 5 Mid-Atlantic Emmy Awards. A native of Coatesville, Pennsylvania, LaMar has also worked as a broadcast news anchor, sports play-by-play announcer, and manager. Our author here this evening is Adam Higginbotham. He was born in England. His narrative nonfiction featured writing has appeared in magazines including GQ, The New Yorker, and The New York Times Magazine. Many of his stories have been optioned or developed in film and TV. The former U.S. correspondent for the Sunday Telegraph magazine and editor-in-chief of The Face, he lives with his family in New York City. Of course, the book we are here for this evening is titled Midnight in Chernobyl, The Untold Story of the World's Greatest Nuclear Disaster. Of course, you know what it's all about, but the book has been named a New York Times Best Book of the Year, a Kirkus Review's Best Nonfiction Book of the Year, a Time Best Book of the Year, and it was awarded the 2020 Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence. Without further ado, please join me in giving a warm Harrisburg welcome to Scott LaMar and Adam Higginbotham.
Let me reiterate the title. New York Times bestseller, Midnight in Chernobyl, The Untold Story of the World's Greatest Nuclear Disaster. Adam Higginbotham, most people could and would identify Chernobyl as the worst nuclear disaster in world history. But give us a quick synopsis of why it was worse than all the others. I know it's hard to do quickly.
I guess it's much bigger in scale in that it released such an enormous amount of radioactive material that spread over such a wide area that persists in the environment until today. I think and it affected a much larger number of people than any other nuclear accident. Because ultimately, I don't know whether I think I better. That's probably better. It ultimately affected an area of Belarus, the Russian Republic, and Ukraine that contained 5 million people. So that affected an enormous number of people. So that's what really makes it the biggest nuclear disaster in history.
What inspired you to write about Chernobyl?
I'm kind of ashamed to admit the original reason that I started to work on the subject, which was that back in 2005, I was looking for the next story to write. And, I'd been writing kind of narrative nonfiction for a while, and I was looking for a new story idea. And I eventually resorted to the most shameful device in journalism, which was to find myself an anniversary. And so worse still, it was late 2005, so I looked at the Wikipedia calendar. It's 2005. I'm planning ahead, so I'm looking at 2006 anniversary. So I go back. I look at 1996. It's December, November. There's not much going on in 1996. Really, the world was largely at peace. It was a good time to be alive. You start going back 1986. There's quite a lot of stuff happens in 1986. But I get to April 19, and I'm like, oh, the Chernobyl disaster. Yes. There could be something in that. And it also coincided with me having just read A Night to Remember.
About the Titanic.
Which is Walter Lord's brilliant book about the Titanic. But I'm sure a lot of people here have read it, but for those that haven't, it just concentrates on the night of the sinking of the Titanic. And it's based on interviews that Lord himself did with survivors, and on mining the records from the congressional inquiry and the inquiries in Britain. And it's a very concise, brilliant narrative of these events. So I thought, well, I could write a magazine story that just does this for the Chernobyl disaster. So I just need to go and find myself some eyewitnesses. So that was initially what happened, is that I persuaded my editors at the Observer magazine in London to send me to Moscow and Kiev to go and find, a handful of survivors to reconstruct from their testimony the events of that night. But what happened is that as soon as I started talking to those people, I discovered that the existing books that I'd read as background research before I left, just had huge holes in the story. And things that were either missing or wrong. And moreover, some of the people that I spoke to kind of told me things about what they'd witnessed, where even in 2006, I was sitting there thinking, I cannot believe that you are still alive to tell me about having seen this stuff, given what you saw. And the stories of everyone, I probably interviewed, a dozen people on that reporting trip, but each one of them had this absolutely incredible story. So as soon as I came back to New York, I think possibly before I'd even finished drafting the piece, I went to see a book agent, because I didn't have a literary agent. So I went to see one, and I was just filled with enthusiasm for this story, because I was just blown away by what a kind of amazing group of human stories was contained in what I'd discovered so far. And I was in his office for about 90 seconds trying to pitch this thing to him before he started looking over my shoulder to see if there was somebody more interesting to talk to. And it took me another 8 or 9 years to convince somebody to let me write a book about it.
So if I look over your shoulder tonight, you know that...
Yeah, I'll get the message pretty quickly. I've seen it before.
Now, as we will find out, there was a lot of secrecy, not surprisingly, in the Soviet Union, but there were a lot of myths, a lot of misinformation, just a lot of information that the world didn't know. Even though you were in Ukraine and the Soviet Union had collapsed, how did you get access to these people? How did you get access to the records and the information? Because if the Soviet Union still existed, you probably, a Western journalist, would probably never have seen this.
No, not at all, none of it. But the truth is that documents and archival material about the accident began coming out not as soon as the Soviet Union collapsed, basically. Those documents started emerging. Because what happened was Boris Yeltsin outlawed the Communist Party and then attempted to put the Communist Party on trial. And part of the case against the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was that they had failed in their duty of care to the Soviet people. And one of the principal pieces of evidence that he used in this case was the Chernobyl disaster. So as a result of that, in support of that case, they released a huge tranche of material that had been up to that point classified. And as soon as that happened, a group of researchers from Stanford swept in, committed all of that stuff to microfilm. And so that's the first sort of tranche of classified material that was released, and that now is I saw it in the library at Harvard, but it's been copied all over the world. And gradually over the years since then, a lot of different bits of the story in archival material have come out. And in terms of getting hold of the people themselves, and I had an enormous amount of help. I had researchers and fixers in Moscow and Kiev. But the most crucial help that I had was from the Chernobyl Museum in Kiev. And that is overseen by this woman, Anna Korolevska, who has spent more than 20 years kind of curating this huge amount of archival material and documents and mementos and memorabilia, but also curating the people associated with the accident. So me and my fixer Taras went to see her right at the beginning of work on the book project, and explained to her what we were doing. And at first she just told us that this was impossible, that no one could possibly write an objective history of the Chernobyl accident. But we kept going back and talking to her more and more, and eventually kind of brought her around to our point of view. And I think that in the end she thought that it was still this kind of stupid, quixotic enterprise, but we were at least sincere, so that she'd give us a hand. So she had the telephone numbers and the contact details of lots of people who she would put us in touch with.
Before we go to that fateful early morning in April, I want to kind of set up what Chernobyl looked like, I was going to say the countryside, but what the surroundings of Chernobyl looked like. What did it look like in 1986, before the accident?
Well, this is actually one of the things that really made me want to write a book about it, because before I started reporting on the subject, it was easy to get the impression, I really had the impression that this was, a sort of stereotypical Soviet experience where this was a place of, grim, monochrome tower blocks, and people living this terrible benighted existence. And the lives of people who worked at the Chernobyl plant and lived in Prypiat, the atomgrad that was built to house them. It was grim before the accident, and then after the accident, it was grim in a different way. But that wasn't true at all. So what I discovered is that as soon as I started talking to people who lived in Prypiat, it became clear that this was it was a great place for many of them to live. It was very well appointed, very well resourced. The Ministry of Energy in Moscow made sure that money was provided to provide the city with things that you didn't get in other Soviet cities. So there were swimming pools, beauty parlors, there was a yacht club, there was a scuba diving club. And it was also surrounded by this beautiful countryside. The city was built on the banks of a river, and it had these white sand beaches. And you'd take your boat out on the river in the summer. You could go sailing. It was a really great place to live. And I think, a third of the population were children. It attracted nuclear specialists from all over the Soviet Union.
Yeah, but the city was built specifically to work at the plant, right?
Exactly.
There was no Pripyat before.
No, it was a company town.
Right.
No. In 1970, when they began the project, there was nothing there at all. There was a sort of peasant village by a river of 10 or 15 houses, but they built the city from scratch to accommodate workers at the plant. And the Chernobyl plant before the accident was one of the jewels in the crown of the Soviet nuclear industry. It was, on paper, it was one of the best performing plants in the Soviet Union. It was a magnet for specialists from all over the USSR.
But when you look at photographs of Chernobyl, the plant before the accident, they're much different than what we're used to seeing here in America. I mean, what many of us are used to seeing is the 3 Mile Island cooling towers, the containment building at TMI. The Chernobyl, I don't know about other Soviet plants, but the Chernobyl looked nothing like that. For one thing, it did not have a containment building. And for those of you who may not be familiar, but just think about 3 Mile Island. You have the cooling towers, but you had that building, kind of the round top, over top of the reactors. Did not have that at Chernobyl, and that was significant, wasn't it? Well, maybe I should ask the question, why wasn't there a containment building?
It was geometrically very difficult because the reactor itself was absolutely enormous. At the time it was built, it was 20 times by volume larger than any kind of comparable Western reactor. But it would also have made it extremely expensive. If they'd built a containment dome over the reactor, it would have doubled the cost of construction. And they did everything they could to save money.
And that wasn't the only thing that, and I'm going to talk about some of the history of Soviet nuclear plants, but they were thinking often about money. They were thinking about deadlines. There was a lot of pressure from the government when they were building Chernobyl, wasn't there?
There was, much as there was in any Soviet manufacturing enterprise, there was a huge amount of pressure to get things done, according to deadlines that were sort of artificially imposed and quite often ridiculous. I spoke to one engineer who remembered sitting in a meeting with their party superiors in the early 70s and being told that the reactor would have to be online by the end of the year. And everybody sitting in the room knew that the reactor was currently simply a hole in the ground filled with concrete. And this was simply impossible. And they just kept repeating the same thing. This guy would say, but comrade, we can't do that. It's a hole in the ground. And he would say, it must be online by the end of the year. And, that's how it worked, is that you were constantly held to these absurd deadlines that everybody involved knew was absurd, but you had to go on regardless.
I think your whole book is an indictment of the Soviet system. I mean, these deadlines, just what you said. I'm surprised that some of the people around the table even spoke up because they were afraid to. Right. When there would be people from the Communist Party or their superiors who would say, this must be done at this date, that they were afraid of getting fired or worse. Right. I mean, that happened often, right?
Well, people would get dismissed or given assignments that they didn't want. And part of the problem at Chernobyl was that it was such an attractive posting that once you were there, you weren't going to do anything to rock the boat because you didn't want to be sent off to, somewhere in Siberia to work at a nuclear plant on the edge of nowhere.
All right, so let's go back to the early morning hours of April 26, 1986. What preceded an explosion and fire at the Unit 4 reactor at Chernobyl was a test. What was being tested, and how did that test lead directly to the disaster at Chernobyl?
It was a safety test that actually was supposed to have been conducted on the reactor before it came online in commercial operation, more than 2 years before, at the end of 1983. And it was, ironically, a safety test that was intended to test a device that would keep the water pumps of the reactor going in the event of a power cut. Because the way that the nuclear plant worked, it couldn't generate electricity to keep its own lights on, or indeed run the water pumps that circulated cooling water through the reactor. That electricity had to come from the grid. So if there was a power cut and there was a total blackout on the grid, then they would need electricity from somewhere to keep the pumps going. And they had emergency diesel generators that would kick in to make this happen. But there was going to be a pause while the generators came up to speed. And that pause was deemed long enough, potentially long enough, that a meltdown could begin in the reactor core. So they wanted another device that they could use to bridge this up to 3-minute gap in which the diesel generators would start circulating the water again. And so they devised this method where these giant turbine generators that they had to generate electricity from the power plant, from the nuclear reactor, as they span down, the inertial energy would supply enough electricity to keep the water circulating through the reactor core. So this is the device, this rundown generator is what they were testing. And that test is what led to the accident.
All right, so what happened with the test?
It relied on them turning the reactor off and then doing this rundown test. And this was supposed to be over extremely quickly, 36 seconds. But in preparing for the test, the reactor operator made a mistake. And the mistake meant that the reactor power fell almost to zero. Now, under these circumstances, the regulations said that if the reactor comes almost to accidental shutdown, you're just supposed to shut it down and leave it alone and abandon anything that you might be doing with it. So what they were supposed to do at this point was just shut the reactor down. It was due for a maintenance shutdown anyway. But what this would have meant was that this test, which had already been postponed for almost 3 years, would have to be postponed again for another 3 years. And they really wanted to get this test done. So the deputy chief engineer who was in charge of running the test insisted that they brought the reactor up to power again. And in so doing, they put the reactor in an extremely unstable condition. And they'd done this by 1 o'clock in the morning on April the 26th. And really at that point, some serious accident was almost inevitable. The condition that they put the reactor into, because they had withdrawn all these safety rods from the reactor, was effectively like cocking the hammer on a revolver. And there were design faults within the reactor that they were ignorant of, that meant that once they inserted the rods back into the reactor, it would be like pulling the trigger on the pistol, and there would be a massive cataclysm, and that's what happened.
And that's what happened, but describe what happened. I mean, there was an explosion. It's kind of, when you talk about a book being theater of the mind, I mean, my imagination is running wild as I'm trying to picture that. And you have a lot of photographs in there too, but I got the sense that it is even hard to describe all the chaos, all the destruction of this plant with what happened next, just because there was so much.
Yeah, there was a lot happening simultaneously, and part of the reason that it proved very difficult to deal with for the operators and then for the government commission that came in afterwards is that all of these terrible things happened simultaneously, and nobody really knew what was going on. So the test was being conducted by these guys in the control room of the reactor. So there was a massive explosion, but from their perspective, what happened is the walls of the room shook and plaster fell from the ceiling and the lights winked out. But the room didn't immediately fill with kind of radioactive steam and flame. I mean, because the reactor was some distance away. So it was only those people who were immediately in the central hall or immediately adjacent to the reactor itself that felt the full force of what had happened.
And yeah, so those people, there were some that were killed immediately. What's going on in the rest of the plant?
Only one man was killed immediately.
And and if am I correct, they never found his body?
They never found his body. I mean, partly because, we don't know, either because he was blown to pieces by the force of the explosion or that his body was simply buried under a load of intensely radioactive debris. And so his body was lost and then could not be recovered because where his body lies is too dangerous to enter.
But, okay, so one death immediately, but a lot of injuries. And by a lot,
yes.
Several dozen injuries right at the very beginning, right?
Yeah, I mean, within 10 days of the explosion, 130 people had been hospitalized in Moscow alone, and more had been hospitalized in Kiev. And those people almost all suffered severe radiation injuries as a result of that initial explosion. Now,
you said that the operators who were in the control room didn't realize, they knew something was wrong because of the wall shaking. They knew something was wrong.
Yeah.
But it took everyone a while, some time, before they realized the true extent of what had happened.
Right. And partly because a lot of them, I think, or several of them certainly, including the station director, Viktor Bryukhanov, experienced some kind of psychological breakdown, I think, whereby, regardless of what they could see with their own eyes, they refused to believe that what had happened had actually happened. And there are several accounts of nuclear specialists who knew exactly what they were looking at, just refusing to believe that something this catastrophic could possibly have happened. I mean, partly because they'd been led to believe that this reactor they were working with was very safe and it was impossible for it to explode.
So what was the damage? What did it look like? In the days afterwards, there were helicopters going over, even though it probably wasn't safe. But there were a lot of people trying to get a look inside to see that reactor and exactly what happened. What did it look like?
Well, first of all, the explosion through the lid of the reactor, which was this 2,000-ton disc.
Wasn't connected. It was just the gravity was holding it on, right?
Exactly.
Right.
So there was this massive explosion, steam explosion, followed, I think, by a hydrogen explosion, although nobody's quite certain. So 1, 2, or possibly 3 explosions. But one of these explosions tore the reactor core itself apart and threw this lid in the air. So it ended up tilted on top of the reactor vessel, but open to the air. And the explosion, one of the 3 explosions was so enormous that it simply obliterated the top of the building that was covering the reactor. So that just disappeared. So the entire building was open to the atmosphere, and beneath it, the reactor was open to the atmosphere. And as the explosion took place, these thousands of tons of graphite that were part of the reactor core immediately caught fire. So then you'd got the reactor was just on fire in a fire that continued for at least 10 days, and that really no one on Earth knew how to put out.
How much radiation was being released at that point?
A lot.
In the book, he's a little more specific than that.
Yeah, I can't remember what the exact figures are, but enough to make it fatal to stand anywhere near it for any length of time.
Now, this is it's happening over several days. So they're learning, as Adam mentioned, many of the Soviet scientists and nuclear engineers just didn't think anything like this could happen. So some of them weren't even believing their own eyes or what they had heard over the telephone. But one of the things that they were concerned with was the China syndrome, the danger of the China syndrome. And again, here in central Pennsylvania, we've heard about the China syndrome, the movie that came out just before the 3 Mile Island accident in 1979, idea being that a meltdown, a reactor core goes through cement and into the earth and hypothetically burn its way all the way to China. Well, apparently, they were very concerned, and it could have happened, right? I don't know about the part all the way to China, but burning into the earth.
Well, as it turns out, the China syndrome, that's actually geographically and geologically impossible.
I thought so.
Because I can't remember where the plant in the movie is. I think it's in California, right?
Right.
But if you draw a line from California to the other side of the Earth, it doesn't.
Okay, so you mean that part is...
It doesn't come out in China. But no, they were terrified that this was going to happen. Not least because Evgeny Velikov, who was one of the principal scientists in control of what they called the liquidation of the consequences of the disaster, had recently seen the China syndrome screened at Moscow State University. And so he apparently was particularly preoccupied with the concept of the China syndrome. But no, they were concerned that first of all, they had no real idea what was going on inside what remained of the reactor building because it was so dangerous to approach that they couldn't get close enough to take any effective readings. So all of their what would you call them, projections of what was going on inside the building were based on atmospheric readings of the isotope composition of the air and remote temperature readings that they took using a temperature monitor that they fired towards the reactor from a helicopter. But they had no way of knowing exactly what was going on. So they made the worst case, they came up with the worst case scenario projections that they could. And one of those was that this molten blob of nuclear fuel and what came to be called corium, as the nuclear fuel absorbed things from around it, parts of the building, parts of the reactor itself, sand that was subsequently dropped onto the reactor from the air by helicopter. It had become hot enough that it was burning through the concrete base of the reactor vessel and then was going to burn all the way through the subsequent basement levels of the reactor building until it reached the Earth, and then it would continue burning at like 1.5 meters a day through the Earth until they feared it would reach the water table, at which point it would either create an enormous explosion, even worse than the first one, or it would simply contaminate the water table of the River Prypiat. The River Prypiat was a tributary of the Dnieper, which is I can't remember, the 5th largest river in Europe, but it provided most of the drinking water to Western Ukraine and ultimately fed into the Black Sea. So what they feared was that even if there wasn't a huge explosion, it was going to contaminate the entire Black Sea with radioactivity.
So how did they stop it from melting through the cement foundation and into the earth?
Well, the truth is, it stopped on its own. They didn't stop it. They did a lot of things to try and stop it, but they were almost all completely pointless. And, hundreds of men were sent into action in various different attempts to stop it from happening. And they took what was a sort of traditional Soviet approach. Rather than fixing on one method to stop this happening, they just tried everything at once. So they thought that they would put gaseous oxygen into what remained of the reactor building in order to starve the fire of oxygen and therefore put the fire out. They attempted to inject liquid nitrogen into the ground beneath the reactor building in order to freeze the soil and stop this molten mass melting through it. And they also launched this effort to build a massive heat exchanger in the ground directly beneath the reactor building, which they did actually complete. But by that time, they realized that the meltdown wasn't going to happen, and so they built this enormous thing, and it was never even turned on.
I want to take a step back for just a moment because how it was handled by the Soviets after the accident is a bizarre story. I mean, it is just an incredible story. But what led up to the accident at Chernobyl is just as interesting because there had been incidents and accidents at Soviet nuclear plants before Chernobyl, including some at Chernobyl, but accidents that were worse than 3 Mile Island. One where there was a partial meltdown.
There was a partial meltdown in Reactor 1 at Chernobyl in 1982. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Another where there were 15 men boiled alive.
Yes, where they inadvertently released steam into a compartment where men were working.
Yeah. So in 1979, here in central Pennsylvania, when there was the accident at 3 Mile Island, which is still considered this nation's worst commercial nuclear accident, but after reading your book, realizing that there really is no comparison, but the 3 Mile Island accident was not publicized in the Soviet Union, which in a way is a bit of a surprise because obviously the Soviets wanted anything that came from the West, they wanted to look bad. But they didn't publicize 3 Mile Island. Why?
No, although it was certainly mentioned after the Chernobyl accident happened. Because they didn't want to bring the nuclear industry into disrepute. They really, they regarded the nuclear industry worldwide as sharing the same reputation. I mean, in very much the same way as the International Atomic Energy Agency regarded this accident after it happened. They wanted to make the nuclear industry worldwide seem as safe as it possibly could. So they did not disseminate a lot of information about 3 Mile Island inside the Soviet Union after 1979.
The design of the reactor at Chernobyl was a huge part of this disaster. RMBK. But it wasn't addressed. I mean, they had several incidents involving, or there were flaws with these reactors before, but there was no information sharing amongst the other nuclear plants in the Soviet Union.
That's right.
If some of that information had been shared, could it have stopped, or maybe it wouldn't have been as bad at Chernobyl?
I think it would probably have stopped it happening because the truth is that the designers of the reactor knew of many of these faults 10 years before the accident happened. But a lot of the fixes were slow-walked, and other fixes weren't attempted in the first place. So, if any of those design faults had been addressed, then the accident may not have happened. And as you say, there were other accidents. There was an accident that happened with the first RBMK reactor that was built in Leningrad in the early 70s. But information about that was covered up and kept even from people at other nuclear plants in the Soviet nuclear industry. Each of these accidents was regarded as a state secret.
Without getting too far in the weeds, getting too technical, what were some of the flaws with this reactor? These reactors, I should say.
Well, the worst one, the most kind of startling one, is the one that was the ultimate proximate cause of the explosion, which was that the emergency control rods that were used to shut down the reactor in the case of an emergency, but also even if you wanted to turn it off under any circumstances, for example, for a routine maintenance shutdown, the control rods are inserted into the core of the reactor and it's designed to quench the chain reaction inside the core. So it's supposed to slow it down and ultimately stop it. But what they had discovered as recently as 1983 at another nuclear plant in Kursk was that, another RBMK plant in Kursk, was that for a split second when those rods were first inserted into the core, instead of slowing the reaction down as you would expect, as they were designed to do, they would increase the rate of reaction. So it was as if the accelerator and the brakes of a car had been wired in reverse. So you're driving along a road in your new car, a deer leaps out in front of you, you stamp on the brakes, and instead of slowing down and stopping the car, suddenly leaps forward and becomes much faster. And that was the sort of most terrifying design defect that they had discovered before the accident, but done nothing to address.
And this isn't just one instance of when the plant was constructed that there were flaws. I mean, even parts that were manufactured in the Soviet Union, equipment that came to Chernobyl, had to be torn apart and reassembled because they were built so poorly. I mean, that's hard for anyone to fathom, but apparently this is something that happened on a regular basis in the Soviet Union.
It was that this is I think the literal translation is pre-erection overhaul, which was an additional stage in Soviet construction throughout Soviet industry that I was told about by the former Ukrainian energy minister, who told me that he only discovered for the first time that this was not universal practice in other countries in a meeting with the British energy minister in London, when he happened to mention it in front of this guy in a meeting. And after the translator spoke, noticed all the British energy workers in the room looking slightly bewildered. And he said that he thought that the translator had just sort of screwed this up. And then he was embarrassed to discover that actually pre-erection overhaul is not a standard part of the construction process in other nuclear plants.
After the disaster at Chernobyl, the first Soviet inclination, as anything that made the Soviet Union look bad, was to keep everything quiet. And they did that in the immediate days after the accident at Chernobyl. Even from the people who lived closest, people who worked at the plant, they tried to keep it quiet, right?
That's right. In fact, there's one guy I spoke to who was one of the nuclear liaisons to the Central Committee in Moscow, told me that he thought that the KGB had actually deliberately tried to cut off telephone communication between workers who were reporting what was going on and their superiors in Moscow on the night of the accident.
Wow, that's just incredible. The world finally found out, when I say finally, it was a couple days later, about Chernobyl because radiation levels went up in Sweden.
That's right.
700 miles from Chernobyl.
That's right.
How did that happen?
Well, I mean, the Soviet government took what they regarded as the traditional approach to releasing information, which was initially to deny that anything had happened. But obviously they couldn't. What they discovered is that unlike other nuclear accidents that had taken place closer to the interior of the USSR, where nuclear material had spread a long way, but partly because the wind was blowing in the opposite direction, partly because it was a long way from the borders of the Soviet Union, they could keep that quiet. But in this case, there was this massive release of radiation that began drifting all across northern and western Europe. And so what happened is that by Sunday evening, that cloud of radioactive material had reached Finland and Sweden. And late on Sunday night, it fell as rain over an area near this nuclear plant, Forsmark, in Sweden. And so one of the members of the chemical testing laboratory inside Forsmark discovered when he came into work on Monday morning that he was setting off the radiation alarms at the entrance of the building. And he was slightly bewildered by this because he hadn't been inside the reactor block at that point. He'd just been having his morning coffee. So he thought, well, what can possibly be, how can I be contaminated? It's not possible. And he and the radiation dosimetrist from the plant just thought that the machine for measuring radiation at the entrance to the plant had been miscalibrated. So they both went back to work. But then when he came down for another coffee a bit later, because this is Sweden and they have a lot of coffee breaks.
It's probably a good thing.
In this case, certainly. He discovered that there was this huge line of guys who were all setting off the radiation alarm at the entrance to the plant because they walked in through the parking lot and all of their shoes were contaminated with radiation from the ground outside where the rain had fallen.
700 miles from Chernobyl.
That's right.
So how many people were exposed after the disaster at Chernobyl in Europe?
Well, all of Europe was exposed.
All?
Yeah, I mean, because apart from anything else, there was the initial explosion. So this huge cloud escaped at 1:30 in the morning on the Saturday. But after that, the fire burned for 10 days. So this plume of radiation just, if you look at it, there's an interesting animated map which depicts just the cesium contamination. And you can see that it begins kind of swirling out to the north and west. And then gradually different tails of this stuff began circulating all the way around the map and spreading out in sort of concentric circles. Ultimately, radiation from Chernobyl, radioactive material from Chernobyl spread throughout the northern hemisphere.
So once this is discovered in Sweden and the world catches on that something had happened. Now, there was some misreporting. I mean, one of the New York papers, was it, had reported
The New York Post.
15,000 people dead?
Immediately, as far as
Yeah.
as far as the Post was concerned, all of their corpses buried as nuclear waste somewhere in Ukraine.
So they were off a little bit with that story.
Just a bit.
But the world wanted more information. But with Soviet newscast on TV, one of the very first stories, that the accident at Chernobyl was 21st in the list of stories that they had done. So there were 20 other stories in the Soviet Union that were more important to their viewers that night than the accident at Chernobyl. And again, at first, the Soviets tried to keep a lid on this, and they didn't want to evacuate the people around the plant. There were some who were saying, listen, we got to evacuate. But there were others that said,
there were disagreements about
yeah.
it, to be fair.
So when did evacuation orders come down? How many people? How far out from the plant?
The town of Prypiat was only evacuated eventually on Sunday afternoon. So the explosion took place at around just before 1:30 on Saturday morning, and then people weren't evacuated until 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
In the meantime, people are living their normal lives on a Saturday and a Sunday. Kids out riding their bikes, playing.
School was on throughout. The kids went to school on Saturday mornings throughout the Soviet Union. So all the kids in Prypiat went to school as normal on Saturday morning.
And May Day, biggest holiday in the Soviet Union, was coming up the next weekend, or that next week. So people were preparing for this holiday. So
what you got to remember is it was a beautiful sunny day. It was a really warm, unseasonably warm, late spring day. So people just went out on the streets. They went swimming in the river. They went to the sand pit, the sandboxes with their kids. People just went about their business as they would do if it was a nice day.
So describe that evacuation, the first one that came down on Sunday afternoon.
So that was the evacuation that evacuated. It was the one part of the Soviet response to the accident. Although it took place late, it was remarkably efficient, and they evacuated 27,500 people in less than 3 hours from Prypiat. They brought in 1,200 buses, a couple of trains, and some boats, and they just got everybody out in a very short period of time.
Throughout the book, I mean, there are just dozens of examples of the Soviets being inefficient and this not working. But I have to admit that there were some things that they were very quick and fast to do. That was one of them. Now, a lot of it was determined because they were desperate and didn't know what to do. But moving 27,000 people in 3 hours is just, I don't know where that ever has occurred anywhere.
Well, I mean, it's also a demonstration of the fact that a centrally planned economy is useful for some things.
So they had some practice with something like that. So initially in the town of Prypiat, there is the evacuation. When's the decision made to spread that evacuation, and how far did they eventually go?
The evacuation, I can't remember, I think May the 2nd or May the 3rd is when the Soviet Prime Minister comes down from Moscow to inspect the situation. And he comes down, and at that point on, I think the 2nd or the 3rd, makes the decision on the spot to evacuate the entire area from 30 kilometers out around the plant. Because he looks at a series of radiation maps that have been produced by different agencies and overlays one on top of another. And he can see that there are these hotspots of radiation all around the area. And there are places in between those hotspots that are apparently less contaminated than others. But there's no way of telling where people are, where the settlements are. In some cases, it's like there'll be a village where one side of the street is deeply contaminated and the other side of the street is not contaminated at all. So he simply takes the decision to have the entire area evacuated 30 kilometers out.
Now, those people who were evacuated, 27,000 people in 3 hours, they took very few of their belongings. they were told that they probably would be coming back in a few days, right?
Well, the Soviet authorities were quite careful about this. They didn't, because this is something that is part of the sort of the Chernobyl myth, is that they're told in this radio broadcast that they would be gone for 72 hours. But actually, that when I got down to it, I discovered that that isn't what happened. They were simply led to believe that they should be. They were told to bring documents and a bit of food to last for 3 days. So obviously, logically, they assume they'll only be gone for 3 days. But nobody actually told them they'd be back after 3 days. But yeah, so they left with just like, a carrier bag with some potatoes and some lard and some, their passports and in some cases like their university diplomas and other stuff like that. But no major belongings. None of them took anything big with them, no.
They left their pets behind.
They were told they had to leave their pets behind because their fur had already become dangerously irradiated.
And so hunters were hired to eliminate those pets.
Well, I don't think they were hired. This is the Soviet Union.
Oh, okay, all right, okay.
No money exchanged hands.
Excuse my Americanism there.
Pressed into service. Yes, the Ukrainian Society of Hunters and Fishermen were enlisted into an effort to go back into the zone several months afterwards to eliminate all of the animals that were roaming free. So that included, household pets like cats and dogs, but also goats, pigs, and cows and other cattle that had been left behind by the fleeing population.
Moving ahead a few years, though, one of the surprises is many of these animals that lived with radiation survived.
Well, the descendants of those dogs are certainly wandering around the exclusion zone to this day. In fact, there's an effort to have some of them adopted, I think, at this point. But yes, they did find some very badly irradiated cattle wandering in the zone after the accident and made those the subject of long-term study. And in those specific cases, they proved to recover in ways that they didn't quite expect.
Like what?
They set up an experimental farm, and they populated it using a single bull that they named Uranium.
There is some irony in some of this,
yes.
too. Yeah.
And 3 cows, and the cows were able to produce calves, even though these animals had been deeply irradiated during the course of the accident.
What about the environment afterwards? I mean, even here in central Pennsylvania, after 3 Mile Island, there were people who told stories about birth defects of not humans, but of farm animals, maybe plants that were growing differently. What about the environment after the Chernobyl accident?
This is an extremely fraught question because, you may have seen one of these documentaries or magazine articles which talk about this sort of miracle of the exclusion zone, which subscribes to this kind of Gaian concept that, Mother Earth has staged this remarkable recovery in the wake of this radioactive catastrophe, and that wildlife seems to be thriving. And there are the wolves and this rare breed of prehistoric horses and birds of prey return to the zone. And so this is used as part of an argument that, actually the radioactive contamination is something that nature has simply shrugged off. But it seems that the truth is that before the accident, this was, although it was a very bucolic seeming environment, it was nonetheless an industrial zone with a power plant at the center of it, added to which it was pretty heavily populated and also an area which was collectively farmed. And the Ukrainians are pretty enthusiastic hunters and fishermen. So what happened after the evacuation was that there were no people left in the exclusion zone. So obviously nobody going out with fishing rods, nobody stalking through the woods with rifles. So yes, wild animals, wild boar, wolves, have indeed returned to live in the zone, and they've been reproducing, and there are a lot more of them than there were in 1986. But a team of scientists has pretty firmly established that radiation exposure, even chronic low-level radiation exposure, is not good for animals. So they do suffer from birth defects, they do suffer from deformities, and some suffer from early death. So I'm afraid the only conclusion that we can draw is that although radiation is bad for animals, then human beings are probably a lot worse.
All right, so you mentioned a few minutes ago when I used the word hire about people being pressed into service. Eventually, there were 600,000 people pressed into service.
Over the course of 4 or 5 years.
4 or 5 years. And correct me if I'm wrong, they did not have a choice. I mean, there were people who were what we would refer to as being drafted.
Oh, no, they were absolutely drafted.
Yeah.
Most of them eventually were military reservists
And
who were called up.
had no choice, that they were sent to clean up and whatever else had to happen with Chernobyl.
Well, you could pay a bribe.
Oh, okay.
You could pay a bribe to the recruiting officer. Interestingly, if you had been drafted to serve in Afghanistan, it would cost you twice as much to pay off the recruiting officer to stop being sent to Kabul than it would to Chernobyl.
Why is that?
I guess even Chernobyl was deemed to be less dangerous than being sent to Afghanistan in the late 80s.
Wow. All right, so 600,000 people that worked on this. The official Soviet record investigation said that 31 people died, 31, from the disaster at Chernobyl. Do we have any idea how many people actually did perish as a result of the Chernobyl accident?
Well, that's a little bit misleading because the 31 is the people who died of acute radiation exposure in the months immediately after the accident. So those people were dead within 3 months of the end of April 86. And the number of people who were killed by radiation can really only be estimated at this point, partly because the Soviet government deliberately covered up what data they did gather. There was data that they simply didn't gather. But also the complexities of epidemiology mean that it's very hard to directly connect radiation to any given death. And most people would associate death from radiation exposure with cancer of various different kinds. And the rate of cancer and the background rate of cancer in the general population is enormously high. Having said that, the best estimate that we have comes from a French epidemiologist named Elizabeth Cardis, who in 2008 estimated that there would possibly be 10,000 additional deaths in the population, the exposed population, as a result of radiation released from Chernobyl. That's 10,000 people in a population of 5 million. So at that point, it becomes kind of statistically undetectable. But what I would say is that concentrating on the number of people killed by radiation from the Chernobyl accident is sort of missing the point, because one statistic that we do know for sure that can be linked directly to radiation from the accident is thyroid cancer. And so to date, I think there have been 10,000 cases of thyroid cancer, mostly in children and young people who are exposed to radiation released by the accident. And those people, although thyroid cancer is relatively easily treated, it's enormously debilitating once you've been treated for it, because you have to have your thyroid gland removed. So your life has changed forever. And so, I mean, that's a good example of people who weren't killed by the accident, but their lives were forever changed. And there are hundreds of thousands of people who would fall into that category. So I think that although, the fatalities are something that preoccupy people when they think about Chernobyl, it's worth thinking about it in a wider context of the people whose lives were destroyed.
I'm going to give the opportunity to the audience to ask a few questions. One final question that I have. In the book, you say that Chernobyl was one of the initial steps that led to the fall of the Soviet Union. How?
I think that the most significant contribution it made was in the way it affected Mikhail Gorbachev's thinking about the work he had to do to address the problems that he inherited with what he called the problems of the era of stagnation that preceded him. Because before the accident, although he talked about glasnost and perestroika, about openness and about restructuring the economy, he hadn't really done anything about it, partly because he was concerned that he'd be turfed out of office by conservatives within the Politburo if he was seen to be too much of a reformer. But what's clear is that the accident, and specifically the investigation into the causes of the accident, made him realize exactly how corrupt the system that he'd inherited was. So it convinced him that he had to stop approaching this idea of reforming gingerly, as he had been, and really plunge very deeply into it. But the result of that was that he went about these economic reforms in particular much too quickly. And if it was ever potentially possible to change the Soviet economy in the way that he intended successfully, it could not be done the way that he went about doing it. And those changes were really one of the most significant contributing factors to the fall of the Soviet Union. The economic reforms were botched, they were done much too quickly, and the whole country fell apart. But at the same time, you know, the way in which he brought glasnost to bear on the accident itself helped change the minds of Soviet people about the way they thought about their government. And so they discovered for the first time exactly the extent to which they'd been lied to through the prism of the Chernobyl disaster. So I think that also is a pretty significant factor in what happened subsequently.
Mm-hmm. I want to give the audience an opportunity to ask a question. Alex over here has a microphone. We're recording this, by the way, to use on a Smart Talk program. So wait until you have a microphone. Can't guarantee that everyone will get on the air, but possibly some can. Alex, go ahead.
Do you speak enough Russian to do interviews and read documents?
I think I know 4 words in Russian. I think I know yes, no, please, thank you, and Atomic Energy Station.
How does your experience with interpreters go?
Well, it certainly didn't make it easier.
No.
I can definitely say that. How did it go? I mean, because certainly what I found was that interviewing men in former Soviet countries was extremely difficult because unless you were drinking, they didn't really want to open up very much. So, sorry, the mic is kind of cutting out a bit.
It's being run by a Soviet electric grid.
So having an interpreter in you, the person you were talking to, you know, that really made that process a lot harder, quite frequently.
There we go.
Thank you.
Now he has the Ukrainian version.
Hello. I had a couple of questions, actually, because according to your index, you touch on both the Mayak and Windscale accidents in the book, one of which being in England. How was access to those materials and that research, especially in regards to Mayak? Like the ability to get access to those materials, I would imagine it to be quite difficult.
Well, no, I mean, Windscale, first of all, although, I mean, what I found, and you will have found if you read the book, is that unfortunately, while we might like to think of what happened in Chernobyl as being a strictly Soviet problem, actually there's a pattern of behavior around nuclear energy that's shared throughout nuclear industries around the world. And that's, you know, this attitude of expedience and cover up and a reluctance to admit mistakes. So the same thing happened in the Windscale accident as happened in Chernobyl, which was that they did an investigation, they found out what went wrong, and then they just blamed the operators and they covered it all up. So, but the truth about what happened in Windscale came out, you know, I think in the 1980s eventually, when a genuine open report was published. And a similar thing happened with Mayak, because Mayak was and remains actually a location of pretty important study for radiologists and radiobiologists. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a lot of work was done on that. A lot of research was done. A lot of research was published at that time. And so the truth about what happened, which had sort of drifted out gradually during the 70s and 80s, really came out after the fall of the Soviet Union. Although I think now, there was a period when MIAC was relatively open, and now it's completely closed again. And actually, there was another radioactive leak from MIAC in the autumn of 2017, which the current Russian government denied.
Thank you for coming to speak to us tonight. My understanding, too, is that in the late 1950s, there was a major nuclear accident in the Ural Mountain regions between Sverdlov and Chelyabinsk. I think it was called Kishtum. Are you familiar with that?
That's the one we were just talking about. It's also known as the MIAC accident.
MIAC, okay. So another question then is, a number of years ago, PBS had a documentary about Chernobyl, and this thing I really remember from that documentary is they said that helicopter pilots would fly over the reactor core and dump material over it to try to stop, cool it down and stop the venting. And it was claimed in the show that they asked for volunteers, that they didn't order people to do that. And I'm wondering if that story is true or not.
Well, they definitely flew over the reactor, and they definitely dropped sand and boron and lead and things into the open face of the reactor core. I don't know that they were volunteers. I mean, because I spoke to a few of these guys, and there was no volunteering mentioned. No, I don't think they were volunteers.
One thing, though, that just to kind of follow up on that quickly, throughout the cleanup and aftermath of the accident, there was a lot of equipment that just stopped working. I mean, things that were designed specifically for the cleanup that just didn't operate because of radiation, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there was nothing that was designed specifically for the cleanup because nobody anywhere in the world had ever prepared for an accident on this scale. But there was equipment that was designed for use in high fields of radiation that just stopped working.
That are now, where's that equipment now?
Well, a lot of it they had to leave in the exclusion zone in these equipment dumps.
It's not buried or anything, it's just a graveyard.
Well, now, given the relative value of scrap metal in Ukraine and other former Soviet countries, those radioactive parking lots are largely empty, actually.
By the way, before we get to the next question, something didn't mention during our conversation is you actually visited Chernobyl and were inside the plant.
That's right, yeah.
What did that look like?
Well, most of the plant looks as it did in 1986 because they kept 3 reactors running for years after the accident.
Yeah, think about that.
And the last one wasn't shut down until 2000. So it's just the part that was encased in what they call the sarcophagus at the very end of the plant that looks like it does in the kind of scary photographs you see of the accident scene. Now the rest of it looks like any other RBMK plant in the former Soviet country. But it's quite unnerving. I mean, because you wear a white coat and a little hat to keep contamination out of your hair, but otherwise, the place is supposed to be reasonably radioactively safe. But we were in the conference room, which is at the extreme other end of the plant, from the opposite end of the station from Reactor Number 4, where they still have the original model that they used to use to show visiting dignitaries how impressive this plant was. And I was kind of taking notes on this massive scale model, and I put my bag with my notebook down on the floor, and the guide who was with us just went, "Don't do that." And I was like, well, what do you mean? And he said, "There's dust everywhere. Don't ever put anything on the floor."
So what'd you do with that bag? You didn't bring it tonight, I hope.
I think it might be fine.
Hi.
Hi.
How many RBMK reactors are still in use?
I think there's 11.
Okay, and Nikolai Coleman...
So none of them are anywhere near here.
I hope not.
I don't know if it matters.
Nikolai Fomin, when he got out of detention, they gave him another job at a nuclear plant.
That's right, yeah.
Is he still?
Is he still alive? I don't. Fomin, I was unable to find out what ultimately happened to him. So he went to work at this plant outside Moscow in the 90s, and I don't know what's happened to him since.
Probably like most people, I saw the miniseries that was just recently on TV, which led me to purchase a book. And when I was researching books, there was a long list of books, and for some reason, I forget why, I purchased this one. I've yet to read it. So
Because it's the best one.
Well,
I'm sure it is.
Yeah.
But my question is, as with other non-Soviet authors, writers, and journalists, are there any disagreements you would have with any of the other literature, current literature on Chernobyl?
Yes. I mean, part of the reason that I wrote the book was that there's a lot of there was a handful of books about this accident came out immediately after it happened that were published in the early 90s in English. But most of those books have, as I said at the beginning, either things missing or things that are just wrong. And then what happened, unfortunately, is that those books became the basis of a lot of things that were written in the interim, both magazine articles and other books. So essentially there was just this echo chamber of inaccuracy that just existed for most of 30 years. And what happened was that nobody, after those books were written, really went back and bothered talking to any of the people that were there or mined any of the archives. And so a lot of the problems that I have are with those other books are those things that were originally misreported and have just been repeated again and again and again. So when I set out to work on the book, I deliberately set out to write something that would be extremely thoroughly sourced, based on archival material and based on face-to-face interviews with people who were there, and cross-referencing as much of that stuff as possible.
Go ahead, Doc.
Can you compare at all what happened in the Soviet Union with what happened in Japan with Fukushima? I know it was a tsunami, but what the response to it?
I think the most striking similarity is that they were completely unprepared for what happened. So after the Chernobyl accident, the Japanese did actually themselves begin developing robotic equipment to clean up after an accident of this magnitude, but then stopped because they didn't think that it was going to be necessary, with the result that just as the Soviet Union had to in 1986, when the robots that they were using to clean up broke down, they were forced to send in more than 3,000 men to do this cleanup work by hand. The Japanese actually had to send in their own bio-robots to do the work by hand themselves.
Yeah, you mentioned early on that the RBMK, you have a 3-minute window.
I think a maximum of 3 minutes, yeah. Estimates
like
varied.
An insane proposition to build into a nuclear reactor.
Well, it's not the reactor, it's the generators. But that's the time that it would take for them to fire up, which is why they had to develop this other safety system to account for that time.
How big are those generators? I mean, they're not like those little Honda things that...
That's a very good question. I don't know, because I've never seen one.
So there's a second book.
Well, part of what happened with Fukushima is they had generators that were totally capable of running the plant behind a wall that they thought would be high enough to hold back any kind of surge. They underestimated the surge. The surge overtook the wall by 3 feet, and the generators are underwater, and diesel generators don't run underwater.
Right.
So that is what other than that, Fukushima would have been fine. their backup plan worked. And I don't know who could have foreseen that. I mean, seriously, you have to plan for disasters, but nobody plans for planes flying into buildings either. There are some things that are just outside the scope. But my real question is, anybody who lives within, I think it's a 7-mile radius of TMI around here, is told or advised to keep a bottle of iodine tablets on hand in case something happens again, even during the decomposition, the deconstruction of the plant now. And I'm guessing the Soviets didn't give those 10,000 thyroid cancer cases iodine, which is protective. So I'm wondering, did they tell them anything when they evacuated them? Because they had been there for some period of time before they left, and they had had full exposure.
Well, they did actually distribute iodine tablets. They just didn't do it as thoroughly as they should have done. And you're dealing with it in many cases extremely remote areas where people were either missed or didn't take the tablets. But then what happened is that a lot of these cases of thyroid cancer would be caused by people in rural communities, kids in rural communities, drinking milk which had become contaminated because the cows had been grazing on radioactively contaminated grass, and that then became concentrated in the milk. And then the kids were particularly susceptible to radioactive iodine, which would concentrate on the thyroid and then result in cancer. So that is what happened in many cases, I think.
I don't really have a question, but more of a comment. I've read a lot of accounts and seen a lot of course, documentaries and things about Chernobyl. And the image I think that sticks with me the most, other than the gaping maw of the reactor from the air, is the images and the accounts of the firefighters that had to go up on the roof and shovel chunks of burning graphite thrown out of the core back in. And they could literally stay out there for like a minute or two. And I wondered if you knew, did all of those men die, or did any of them survive?
They didn't all, well, they're not all dead now. I mean, because I interviewed the general who commanded that operation. You're talking about the reservists, because they weren't, some of them I think were firefighters, but not all of them. They were military reservists who went out onto the roof in September and October of 1986, long after the fire had gone out. And so I spoke to their commander, and he did actually give me a list of people who were still alive. So I know that they're certainly not all dead.
And actually, I think that, when you're looking for the spin that the Soviet Union put on top of it, as Adam writes about thoroughly in the book, is that's what the Soviet government focused on, was the heroism of those firefighters.
Right, of the first responders who went out on the night of the accident. That was they fixed on that as their kind of, as their propaganda approach to lionize those guys, in a way to deliberately distract from other details of what happened. So for instance, to this day, really, people don't really recognize that the people that far greater numbers of operators and engineers from within the plant itself placed themselves in danger that night, but they were never mentioned in news reports in Pravda and Izvestia.
So I know a lot of the presentation was focused on what happened on the night, but did you interview any of the people in the relocation villages to talk about how they rebuilt their lives from, because I've heard and talked to people who were relocated, and they talk about kind of just being dropped off in the middle of a field, left with their bag of potatoes and their few belongings. Did you talk to any of them about how they kind of look back on that to say, how do you rebuild with no resources and kind of no sense of direction?
Well, they were. What happened is that they were relocated in the immediate aftermath of the evacuation, but they would remain there for days or weeks, and then ultimately, again, in another indication of one of the few benefits of living in a centrally planned economy, all of these people were found jobs and homes elsewhere. So a lot of those people from Prypiat, for example, who were relocated, wound up living in the same massive housing complex on the outskirts of Kiev. So when I was interviewing people, I would find that one person who worked in the plant control room would live, 2 doors down the hallway from another person who worked in the control room. But no, their lives were changed forever. They were uprooted from this place that they loved living in, and they were taken, 120 kilometers away to make their lives again somewhere else. But they had to leave everything behind. They were given money by the state to buy new furniture or a new car or whatever they had left behind if they could prove that they left it behind. But that they had to start their lives all over again, and often they were shunned by their immediate neighbors because people were terrified that radiation was in some way contagious.
Even the kids that went to school, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Mm.
Do you have any insights as to what happened this past summer in Russia?
You mean with the radioactive contamination in the White Sea? No. All I know is that because I spoke to one of the nuclear non-proliferation specialists that I spoke to when I was researching the book, and I emailed with him to ask him if he knew what was going on, and he essentially said, nobody knows, and we're extremely unlikely to find out because they've covered it up. And that accident, whatever it was, which they think was a nuclear-powered cruise missile exploding on launch, that took place in a sealed area. So I don't think we're likely to find out the full story of what happened for some time yet.
Yes, Adam, on the legacy that Chernobyl left in terms of the isotopes and the half-life, can you comment on the food chain? In other words, after the accident, is there still regulation currently in terms of food coming out of the Ukraine and Russia into Eastern Europe? Did you find out anything interesting relative to the current food chain?
That, I'm afraid, was beyond the purview of what I was reporting. That's an excellent question that I don't know the answer to. One would hope so.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so this will be a final question.
How has the memory of Chernobyl been constructed in Russia? How has it been constructed in Ukraine? And is there a stark contrast?
Can you explain what you mean by constructed?
Yeah, the public memory, public commemoration, aside from the plan itself.
Oh, I see.
How's it memorialized?
So there is an annual ceremony in Kiev that's devoted to the victims of Chernobyl, and there are liquidators groups and survivors groups are pretty active in Ukraine, and there are the same sort of liquidators associations of veterans associations in Russia. But I don't know the extent to which there's memorialization of the events themselves. And I know much less about the way that works in Russia than I do in Ukraine.
But what about Russians and Ukrainians? Do they remember it differently, the history?
Well, they certainly do, because the two countries do not get on very well. And this is a kind of, one of those, it's one of the many ways in which Moscow is correctly perceived to have victimized the Ukrainians over the years. So this is seen as one node on a chain of events that stretches back 100 years.
Mm. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming here. Alex, I think you want to say something to everyone too, but I just wanted to, before Alex did, mention that we are recording this for WITF Smart Talk, and the program will probably air one day next week. I wish I could tell you which day specifically. I know it won't be Thursday or Friday, but one day next week that it will air, so be sure to tune in. Go ahead, Alex.
First off, let's just give a huge round of applause for Adam and Scott.